What if the most dangerous enemies of the Nazi regime weren't hiding in bunkers or marching under foreign flags, but seated at Hitler's own table? This is the story of 33 Nazis who turned. Some spied, some plotted, some ran. All of them betrayed the regime they helped build, and none of them walked away unchanged. Loyalty was law in the Third Reich. So what do you call the men who broke it? Traitors? Heroes? Survivors? Or something far more complicated? Welcome to 33 Nazis who betrayed Hitler. The truth doesn't come with a uniform. Before we dive in, if you love long-form dives into the hidden, the haunted, and the historically uncomfortable, go ahead and subscribe. It helps keep the lights on and the stories strange. And while you're here, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? Are you up late with insomnia or sneaking this in on your lunch break? Drop it in the comments, I read every one. 1. Hermann Julius Oberth. The man who gave Hitler rockets also gave the Allies dreams. That's the strange legacy of Hermann Julius Oberth, a Romanian-born physicist often called the grandfather of modern rocketry. He wasn't a military man. He wasn't particularly loyal to Hitler either, but he taught someone who was, Werner von Braun. Under the Nazis, Oberth lent his expertise to the V-2 rocket program, the same one that bombarded London while children in bunkers clutched their knees and prayed the ceilings wouldn't fall. But here's where it gets blurry. After the war, Oberth crossed oceans with a smile and a suitcase full of equations, becoming a prized asset in America's space race. He taught at Huntsville, gave lectures to future NASA engineers. He went from building death machines for a dictator to inspiring lunar landings. Did he defect, or simply float upward to whoever had the bigger launch pad? The next man didn't just float, he ran. 2. Fritz Kolbe. Fritz Kolbe was a bureaucrat in a suit, the kind of man you'd walk past in a hallway without remembering his face. But behind the dull gray desk was the most valuable spy the Allies had inside the Nazi regime. As a mid-level functionary at the German Foreign Office, Kolbe had access to secret cables, ambassador reports, and the pulse of Hitler's diplomatic corps. Instead of climbing the Nazi ladder, he stuffed his briefcase with stolen documents and handed them to the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor to the CIA. He didn't want money. He didn't want glory. He just hated fascists. For this, his colleagues called him a traitor. The Americans called him George Wood. Historians call him one of the most effective spies of World War II. And yet, after the war, Germany shunned him. Too much betrayal, even for the righteous. The next man betrayed quietly, with wings on his uniform. By the way, if you're 2 stories in and still watching, you're one of us. So hit that subscribe button to stay in the loop for more long-form dives like this one. And just out of curiosity, where are you watching from? What time is it right now on your end? Is this your midnight rabbit hole or your morning mystery routine? Let me know in the comments. I'm always curious who's out there listening. 3. Erwin Gertz. Erwin Gertz wore the Luftwaffe's uniform, but his allegiance floated higher than any German aircraft. A colonel with a clean record and cold eyes, Gertz was the sort of officer you'd expect to be loyal. But behind the clipped orders and military neatness was a man passing secrets to a resistance group known as the Solf Circle. He leaked bombing plans, leaked operational briefings, and when that wasn't enough, he leaked hope, something that could get you killed faster than treason. His reports made their way through underground channels and eventually into the hands of Allied intelligence. Every mission he sabotaged was done with the precision of a true believer. In Germany's defeat. His betrayal wasn't flashy. It was slow, quiet, methodical, the kind of treachery that looks a lot like patriotism in reverse. But the next man didn't whisper through the cracks. He gave the Allies the keys to the enigma. 4. Hans Thilo Schmidt. Hans Thilo Schmidt didn't look like a man who'd changed the course of a war. A paper pusher. A middle-aged bureaucrat with thinning hair and a family name worth less than a postage stamp by the time the Reich took over. But in the quiet corners of cipher rooms, he saw something monumental. the Enigma machine. He didn't just see it, he sold it. To the French. Quietly. Repeatedly. For years. Schmidt passed along instruction manuals, technical details, internal memos, anything that explained how the Germans encrypted their communications. At first, the Allies didn't know what to do with it, but the data wound its way to Bletchley Park, and the rest is Alan Turing's legacy. Without Schmidt, there's no Ultra. Without Ultra, the war drags on. Maybe ends differently. Schmidt died before seeing how much his betrayal mattered. But the next man? He gave the Allies visions from inside Hitler's war machine, before the bullets flew. 5. Rudolf Rössler. Rudolf Rössler was not a soldier, not a spy, not even a government insider. He was a Swiss publisher who became a conduit for some of the most precise German military secrets of the entire war. His code name was Lucy. No one really knows how a man with no official access ended up receiving and relaying exact Wehrmacht battle plans to the Soviets via Switzerland. Some say he had moles deep within the German high command. Others whisper that his sources were part of a Soviet deception network. But what's certain is this: the information was real, accurate, timely, the kind of intelligence that saves lives or destroys them. Lucy knew when Germany would strike, how it would move, who would lead. And yet, to this day, no one can quite explain how. Rössler made espionage look supernatural. But the next man, he did his betraying from within the Gestapo itself. 6. Hans Bernd Gisevius. Hans Bernd Gisevius joined the Gestapo early, then moved to the Abwehr, then to the German consulate in Zurich. A career climber on the surface, but something else entirely underneath. A double-crossing moral contortionist with a well-tailored conscience. From within Nazi institutions, Gisevius passed intelligence to the Allies and actively conspired with resistance figures plotting Hitler's assassination. He hated what Germany had become and used the tools of the regime to dismantle it from within. At the Nuremberg trials, he testified against former colleagues, unloading secrets like poison in a courtroom. But the real twist? He survived it all. He walked away, wrote memoirs, smoked cigars by the lake. Gisevius wasn't a hero. He was an opportunist with a grudge and a photographic memory. And still, he helped. The next man on the list didn't just help from the sidelines. He ran the intelligence service and tried to burn it down from the inside. 7. Wilhelm Canaris. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris ran the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, and he used it as a cover to undermine Hitler's regime from within. While his peers worshipped power, Canaris worshipped ambiguity. He posed as a loyal servant to the Führer, while secretly sabotaging Nazi operations, feeding information to the Allies, and protecting resistance members. He warned Norway of Germany's impending invasion. He helped Jews escape. He even sabotaged Nazi plans to kidnap the Pope. But he did it all carefully, behind layers of half-truths and plausible deniability. His offices were wired. His allies were watched. He played a chess game where one wrong move meant death. In the end, it wasn't his enemies who got him. It was his own side. Canaris was executed in a concentration camp weeks before the war ended. His silence died with him. The next man on our list? He was one of Canaris's closest co-conspirators, and just as dangerous. 8. Hans Oster. Hans Oster made treason look like paperwork. A major general and deputy head of the Abwehr, Oster was the kind of man who hid rebellion in reports and betrayal in bureaucracy. He used his position to undermine the Nazi regime at every turn, leaking information, forging documents, issuing travel papers to Jews, and recruiting conspirators to overthrow Hitler. His disdain for the regime wasn't impulsive. It was systemic, methodical. He saw Nazism as a moral collapse wearing a uniform, and he treated resistance as a professional obligation. Oster was one of the first military men to envision a coup, and one of the few to stick with it as the noose tightened. After the failed July 20th plot, his name surfaced. He was arrested, humiliated, and finally executed, quietly, without ceremony. But his blueprints for resistance lived on. The next man used those same blueprints and walked straight into the jaws of history. 9. Erwin von Lehausen. Erwin von Lehausen had a title long enough to distract you from what he was really doing. As chief of Abwehr Section 2, he was officially in charge of sabotage and espionage. Unofficially, he was part of the conspiracy to bring the Nazi regime to its knees. A decorated intelligence officer, Lehausen had access to some of the darkest corners of Hitler's military machine, and he used that access to help the Allies and shield resistance efforts. He supplied explosives to the July 20th conspirators. He kept files on Nazi war crimes. He even testified at Nuremberg, becoming the first insider to publicly expose the inner rot of the Third Reich. He survived the war, barely, and vanished into post-war obscurity like a man slipping out the back door of a crumbling mansion. But the next conspirator on our list didn't slip out. He went in deeper, dragging his whole family with him. 10. Hans von Dohnanyi. Hans von Dohnanyi fought the Nazis with a lawyer's mind and a saboteur's nerve. A jurist by training and an Abwehr officer by choice, he documented Nazi crimes meticulously, gathering evidence not for propaganda, but for prosecution. His files included the names of SS officers, testimonies of atrocities, and internal memos the regime wanted buried. He smuggled Jews out of Germany using forged travel papers disguised as official military orders. While most resisted in whispers, Dohnanyi put it on paper. He believed the regime would fall, and when it did, someone would need the receipts. His work helped lay the legal foundation for the Nuremberg trials, but he wouldn't live to see them. Arrested and tortured, Dohnanyi was executed in a concentration camp just weeks before Hitler's fall. His life ended in silence. But the next man on our list chose to break that silence with a bomb. 11. Klaus von Stauffenberg. Klaus von Stauffenberg was the face of the July 20th plot, the military aristocrat who planted a bomb under Hitler's table. He believed Germany had lost its soul, and if it meant losing his life to reclaim it, so be it. He wasn't always a dissenter. In fact, early on he admired Hitler's restoration of German pride. But as the war dragged on and the crimes piled up, that admiration curdled into horror. Stauffenberg used his high-level access as chief of staff for the Reserve Army to initiate Operation Valkyrie, a coup designed to kill Hitler and dismantle the Nazi state from within. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. Within hours, Stauffenberg was executed by his own comrades. He died shouting, "Long live sacred Germany!" Whether he was a hero, a traitor, or both, history still argues. The next man didn't wait for the war to turn. He started planning betrayal early. 12. Henning von Treschow. Henning von Treschow was the type of officer Hitler should have feared more, because he still wore the uniform. Calm, brilliant, and charismatic, Treschow operated in the heart of the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front, where the war's darkest orders came through. And he opposed them. From mass killings to scorched earth tactics, he saw the regime's brutality firsthand and decided to act. Years before Valkyrie, Treschow was laying the groundwork for revolt. He smuggled British anti-Hitler propaganda into Germany, attempted early assassinations, and recruited fellow officers into resistance cells. One of his most famous plans involved hiding a bomb disguised as a liquor bottle on Hitler's plane. It failed to detonate. That failure didn't break him. It convinced him the resistance needed to grow smarter, quieter, more ruthless. Treschow didn't just want Hitler dead. He wanted the entire system to collapse. The next man on the list tried to cut that system off at its head, literally. 13. Erich Feldgiebel. General. Erich Feldgiebel wasn't just sabotaging the regime. He was sabotaging its voice. As chief of army signals, Feldgiebel had the keys to the Reich's communications grid. Every encrypted order, every classified message, every desperate call in the Führer bunker passed through his fingertips. And he used that access to do what most traitors couldn't: isolate Hitler in real time. During the July 20th plot, Feldgiebel's job was to cut the Nazi leadership off from one another. No phones, no lines, no orders, no reinforcements. For a few critical hours, it worked. But when the bomb failed to kill Hitler, Feldgiebel was left exposed. He was arrested, tortured, and eventually executed. His final act wasn't defiance, it was silence. He refused to name names. Feldgiebel's betrayal was surgical, strategic, and ultimately doomed. But the next man took that same spirit of mutiny and tried to spread it across an occupied nation. 14. Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel. Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel was the Wehrmacht's military governor in occupied France, Nazi power personified in a gray uniform and polished boots. But beneath the surface, he was working to gut that power from within. A key player in the July 20th plot, Stülpnagel had one mission: neutralize Nazi forces in France the moment Hitler fell. He ordered the arrest of hundreds of SS officers in Paris, and for a few fleeting hours it worked. The city that once hosted Nazi parades was now under mutinous control. Then came the radio broadcast. Hitler survived. The illusion shattered. Chaos returned. Stülpnagel tried to disappear into the countryside, but was quickly captured. His attempt to escape failed, and he was brought back in chains. He was executed before the war ended, a general without a country. But his legacy lingered. The next man on our list never wore a uniform, but he planned resistance like war. 15. Ludwig Beck. Ludwig Beck was once chief of the German General Staff, one of the architects of modern German strategy. But when Hitler began steamrolling laws, treaties, and reason itself, Beck resigned. Quietly at first, then loudly, then permanently. For years, he stood in the shadows of Berlin's opposition, using his influence to connect military resistance with civilian dissidents. He wasn't a bomb planter or a codebreaker. He was a unifier, a broker of conscience among collaborators and conspirators. And when the July 20th plot finally moved into action, Beck was its designated interim head of state, a placeholder for the Germany that might have been. After the bomb failed, Beck was arrested. Given the option to take his own life, he attempted it, but didn't succeed. The Gestapo finished the job. Beck's fall marked the collapse of the German military resistance. But the next man kept fighting. On the streets, not the battlefield. 16. Julius Lieber. Julius Lieber didn't come from the officer class or the upper echelons of Prussian military tradition. He came from the political underground. A former Social Democrat, Lieber was one of the few German politicians to survive the early Nazi purges, though he didn't escape unscathed. He spent years in concentration camps, marked for his opposition. When released, instead of fading quietly into civilian life, he rejoined the resistance, this time from within. He linked arms with Stauffenberg, Beck, and the other military conspirators, offering not just support, but a vision for post-Hitler Germany rooted in civilian leadership and democratic reform. His inclusion in the plot proved the resistance wasn't just a military affair. It was moral, ideological, and national. He was set to become Minister of the Interior after the coup. The coup failed. Lieber was arrested and executed. The next conspirator met the same fate, though his collar was clerical, not political. 17. Alfred Delp. Alfred Delp wore the collar of a Jesuit priest, but his war wasn't spiritual, it was secret. As a member of the Kreisau Circle, a resistance group with ties to the July 20th plot, Delp bridged the gap between faith and rebellion. His sermons hid subtext. His writings cloaked defiance. His hands, though consecrated, were working to unseat a tyrant. Delp believed the Nazi regime was a moral blight, a sickness that no Christian conscience could abide. Arrested in the wave of crackdowns following the failed coup, Delp was imprisoned, tortured, and eventually hanged. The rope didn't silence him. His prison writings survived, smuggled out and later published as reflections on dignity, faith, and tyranny. Delp's betrayal of the Nazi regime wasn't just political, it was theological. He saw Hitler's Germany as a heresy, not just a dictatorship. And yet, the next man on our list fought from inside the regime's most feared uniform. 18. Wolf Heinrich von Helldorf. Wolf Heinrich von Helldorf had one of the regime's most ironic resumes. He was Berlin's chief of police and a secret conspirator. A former Nazi stormtrooper, he seemed like a true believer, loud, brutal, connected. But somewhere between the brutality of street violence and the bureaucracy of law enforcement, Helldorf turned. Historians still debate why. Was it moral revulsion? Political ambition? Personal disillusionment? Whatever the cause, by the early 1940s, Helldorf was working with the July 20th plotters, using his position to shield resistance members, pass information, and, if the coup had succeeded, neutralize SS forces in the capital. His betrayal came from within the beast itself. But when the bomb failed, so did the illusion. Helldorf was arrested, tortured, and executed with the others. He died in disgrace, at least by Nazi standards. But disgrace has layers. The next man never wore a uniform, but tried to tear Hitler's empire down with a diplomat's handshake. 19. Ewald von Kleist-Schmenzen. Ewald von Kleist-Schmenzen wasn't a general or a priest. He was a conservative aristocrat with a castle, a title, and an abiding hatred for Adolf Hitler. From the earliest days of the regime, Kleist-Schmenzen saw Nazism for what it was, a grotesque distortion of nationalism, a cult of rage disguised as revival. He opposed Hitler before it was fashionable, and certainly before it was survivable. In 1938, he took it upon himself to travel to London as an unofficial envoy of the German resistance. He came offering no bribes, just warnings. Hitler would plunge Europe into war unless he was stopped. Britain didn't listen. The war came anyway. Back home, Kleist-Schmenzen joined the inner circle of the July 20th plotters. His role was ideological. He was the conscience of the conspiracy. That didn't save him. After the plot failed, he was executed. His son would later continue the legacy of resistance. But the next defector wasn't born into castles, he defected into chaos. 20. Otto John. Otto John looked like a bureaucrat, but behind the round glasses and careful mannerisms was a man caught between worlds. As a legal advisor in the Luftwaffe, John seemed to be just another cog in the Nazi war machine. But he was actually a silent conspirator, involved in early resistance efforts and loosely tied to the July 20th plot. When the Gestapo caught wind, he fled to Spain, then to Britain, where he became an intelligence asset. After the war, he returned to West Germany and was appointed head of the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, a new intelligence agency tasked with keeping the ghosts of the past from crawling back. But the Cold War turned everything upside down. In 1954, John disappeared in East Berlin. Some claimed he defected to the Soviets. Others said he was kidnapped. Either way, he ended up on the wrong side of the wall. The next man didn't flee. He resisted from within, with words sharper than rifles. 21. Friedrich Reich Malacheven. Friedrich Reich Malacheven wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was a writer, angry, eloquent, and fed up. Born into nobility but armed with a pen, Reich watched the rise of Nazism with a mix of disgust and dread. Unlike many Germans, he didn't hide his opinions. He wrote them down. His diary, Diary of a Man in Despair, is a scathing, poetic, almost surgical indictment of the regime, penned in real time as the world fell apart. Reich saw Hitler as a criminal clown, a maniac whose rise signaled not just political decay, but moral collapse. He refused to participate, refused to salute, refused to pretend. Eventually, the Gestapo noticed. He was arrested and sent to Dachau, where he died shortly before liberation. He left no resistance network, no bomb plot, no espionage trail, just a voice. And that voice, even in silence, continues to accuse. The next man tried to make that accusation explosive. 22. Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorff. Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorff didn't believe in symbolic resistance. He believed in detonation. A colonel in the German army and a key member of the military resistance, Gersdorff volunteered for a suicide mission in March 1943. The plan was simple in theory and lethal in practice. Carry explosives in his coat during a memorial tour with Hitler and detonate them while standing beside him. It would be quick, loud, and final, except Hitler didn't cooperate. The Führer breezed through the exhibition in under 10 minutes, far too fast for Gersdorff to activate the delayed fuse, so he walked out with the bomb still ticking inside his coat, slipping away to defuse it in a bathroom stall. He survived, barely. After the failed July 20th plot, he was interrogated but never directly implicated. He lived to testify about the inner rot of the regime, a soldier who had tried to trade his life for his country's soul. The next man resisted not with bombs, but with quiet, persistent sabotage. 23. Hermann Kaiser. Hermann Kaiser wasn't a general or a politician. He was a quiet cog in the sprawling machine of the Nazi administration, an official working within the Army Ordnance Office. But under that unremarkable exterior was a member of the Kreisau Circle, a group of intellectuals, officers, and reformers quietly working to design a post-Hitler Germany. Kaiser's role was less dramatic than a bomb plot, but just as subversive. He leaked information, coordinated meetings, and kept lines open between military dissidents and civilian thinkers. His strength was subtlety. While others gambled everything on explosive moments, Kaiser played the long game: quiet disruption, strategic communication, patient betrayal. He was arrested after the July 20th plot unraveled and executed in 1945. He left behind no famous last words, no sweeping manifesto, just a record of quiet, deliberate opposition. The next man, however, did carry a vision, and he tried to deliver it directly to the Allies. 24. Adam von Trott. Zu Sulz, Adam von Trott. Zu Sulz was everything the regime claimed to admire: elite, educated, impeccably connected. Oxford-educated and aristocratic, he moved in international circles that the Nazis could never quite understand, and that made him dangerous. As a diplomat in the Foreign Office, von Trott walked the line between appearing loyal and acting against the state. He used his position to travel abroad, secretly reaching out to Britain and the United States with a desperate proposition: help us overthrow Hitler. He carried with him outlines of a democratic Germany, one freed from Nazism and capable of rebuilding. Most Western leaders didn't listen. Trott zu Sulz returned home to find the resistance shrinking and the Gestapo tightening. After the failed July 20th plot, he was arrested, interrogated, and executed. His betrayal wasn't just political, it was ideological. And the next man shared that ideology, but worked behind closed doors, drawing maps of treason. 25. Peter York von Wartenberg. Peter York von Wartenberg was a resistance thinker dressed in a jurist's robes, quiet, analytical, and constitutionally allergic to tyranny. A descendant of nobility and a seasoned civil servant, York didn't carry bombs or forge papers. He carried frameworks, meticulous visions of how Germany could rebuild itself after the collapse of the Nazi regime. As a founding member of the Kreisau Circle, he helped draft political models, legal principles, and moral arguments for a post-Hitler society. He believed in accountability, dignity, and the law, three things that made him an enemy of the state. He kept in close contact with military conspirators, bridging the civilian-military divide in the resistance. His strength wasn't firepower, it was philosophy with consequence. After the July 20th plot failed, he was arrested, tried in the People's Court, and executed by guillotine. His writings survived, serving as one of the clearest blueprints for democratic rebirth. The next man also left behind a record, one the SS tried very hard to bury. 26. Kurt Gerstein. Kurt Gerstein was an SS officer who saw too much and refused to stay quiet. Originally joining the SS to investigate the death of his sister under the Nazi euthanasia program, Gerstein found himself in the heart of the machinery of genocide. But instead of falling in line, he turned his access into resistance. He witnessed the mechanics of extermination firsthand and smuggled out reports, hoping to alert the world. He told diplomats, clergy, neutral governments, anyone who might listen. Most didn't. After the war, he wrote the now infamous Gerstein Report, a detailed account of the atrocities he had observed. To this day, historians debate whether he was a whistleblower or a deeply compromised participant trying to absolve himself after the fact. But the record stands. He tried to expose the horror while still inside it. His testimony remains one of the most haunting documents of the era. The next man? He tried to out-negotiate history itself. 27. Walter Schellenberg. Walter Schellenberg knew when the ship was sinking and tried to be the one who sold the lifeboats. As head of the SD Security Service and a senior SS officer, Schellenberg operated at the upper tiers of Nazi intelligence. He played a double game: loyal enforcer in public, reluctant skeptic in private. By 1943, he began quietly contacting neutral powers, Sweden, Switzerland, even the Vatican, floating the idea of a negotiated peace. Schellenberg saw which way the war was turning and hoped to broker a future for himself and other reasonable Nazis. In the final months of the war, he tried to position himself as a go-between for Himmler and the Allies. The Allies weren't buying. After the war, he was tried and sentenced, but served only a few years before dying of illness and exile. His betrayal wasn't out of principle. It was survival wrapped in strategy. The next man may have vanished, but not without leaving behind a riddle still unsolved. 28. Heinrich Müller. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, was one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany. And then he vanished. Officially, Müller was no traitor. He signed the orders, ran the interrogations, and coordinated with Eichmann on the final solution. But rumors have always trailed behind his name like smoke. Some say Müller defected to the Soviets in the final days of the war, trading secrets for sanctuary behind the Iron Curtain. Others claim he died in the ruins of Berlin, body never found, or slipped out through one of the same escape routes he used to hunt others. Soviet files hinted they might have debriefed a high-value Nazi defector matching his profile. The truth remains buried under decades of conflicting archives, redacted reports, and Cold War gamesmanship. If he did defect, Müller would be the ultimate betrayal, Nazism's secret police chief turned informant. But even ghosts leave paper trails. The next man did too, one telegram at a time. 29. Ernst vom Rath. Ernst vom Rath's name is most remembered for what was done to him, but his own role remains murkier. A German diplomat stationed in Paris, vom Rath was the figure whose assassination by a Jewish teenager in 1938 was seized upon by the Nazi regime to justify Kristallnacht, the infamous pogrom that followed. But hidden in that narrative is a lesser-known thread. Vom Rath had been under suspicion by his own government for expressing private doubts about the regime's extremism. Some claimed he had passed discreet information to Western contacts, nothing damning, but enough to raise eyebrows in Berlin. Others believed his diplomatic cables were occasionally laced with veiled warnings rather than loyalty. His politics remain ambiguous, and whether he truly betrayed the regime or merely hesitated in its shadow is still debated. But in a system that demanded total allegiance, Ambiguity itself was treason. The next man wasn't ambiguous at all. He told everything in perfect detail. 30. Hans Guderian. Hans Guderian was a tank commander, strategist, and early architect of Germany's blitzkrieg warfare. During the war, he was no dissident. He served loyally, pushing deep into Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. But when the Third Reich collapsed, Guderian made a quiet pivot. Captured by Allied forces, he didn't go down with the ship. Instead, he cooperated extensively, offering the Allies insights into Nazi military structures, strategy, and internal rivalries. He portrayed himself as a soldier, not a politician. Just a man doing his duty, supposedly uninvolved in atrocities. But his betrayal came in the form of narrative control. Guderian's memoirs and debriefings helped shape the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, downplaying complicity and redirecting blame. He rewrote history in real time, turning from general to storyteller. He didn't defect during the war, but once it was over, he defected from guilt. The next man also rewrote his story, but with far more flair. 31. Albert Speer. Albert Speer called himself the Nazi who said sorry, but history has never stopped debating what he was really sorry for. As Hitler's architect turned armaments minister, Speer wielded enormous power during the war's final years, streamlining weapons production while the world around him crumbled. He was no passive technician. He was an enabler, an organizer, a man who kept the Reich's war machine running longer than it should have. But after Hitler's death, Speer pivoted. At Nuremberg, he offered full cooperation, admitted moral responsibility, and condemned the regime he'd once served with architectural pride. His willingness to testify, against his peers, against the system, earned him 20 years in Spandau rather than a rope at Nuremberg. After his release, he published bestsellers, painting himself as the lone technocrat who'd seen the light. But many argue he tailored the truth to save himself. The next man didn't tailor his confessions, he turned them into indictments. 32. Otto Ohlendorf. Otto Ohlendorf was the bureaucrat of death, who later turned state witness. As commander of Einsatzgruppe D, he oversaw operations behind the Eastern Front, operations that left mass graves in their wake. But Ohlendorf's betrayal came after the guns fell silent. Captured by Allied forces, he didn't just confess, he explained. In exhaustive, chilling detail, he outlined how the mobile killing units were organized, how orders were given, how quotas were met. He named names, gave times, locations, command chains. Some called it cooperation. Others called it a strategy, an attempt to justify his actions as mere duty while implicating others to reduce his own culpability. His testimony helped shape the prosecution at the Einsatzgruppen trials, but it didn't save him. He was sentenced to death and hanged in 1951. Ohlendorf's betrayal wasn't of conscience. It was transactional. The final man on our list also cooperated after capture, but with something more: calculation and a cold sense of timing. 33. Walter Warlimont. Walter Warlimont served as Deputy Chief of Operations under the Nazi High Command, placing him near the nerve center of Hitler's war strategy. He wasn't a frontline commander. He was a strategist, a planner, and a courier of brutal efficiency. But when the Reich fell and the interrogators arrived, Warlimont didn't hold the party line. He gave the Allies detailed accounts of high-level decision-making, shedding light on Hitler's inner circle, the dysfunction of Nazi leadership, and the collapse from within. He painted a picture of incompetence mixed with ideology, a regime sabotaging itself through delusion. His cooperation helped Allied analysts understand the war machine's inner logic, or lack thereof. Though convicted at Nuremberg, he avoided a death sentence and was released after just a few years. Warlimont didn't resist the regime during its reign. He resisted its memory afterward, one foot in the past, one eye on legacy. And that's how betrayal often survives, not in what they did, but in how they retell it.